In gardening, our attention is often focused on the plants. Are they healthy, green, and lush? Are they growing in the right place? Are they producing flowers or fruits or vegetables like we hoped that they would? However, when it comes down to it, much of what a plant needs, and especially the things that are in our control as gardeners, depend on having healthy soils. This lecture will describe some different properties of soil that affect plant growth so that you can start to understand your soils and improve them for a successful garden. To better understand plant growth, let's dig in and talk a little bit about soils. Soil is a medium for plant growth, which means that as a gardener, you'll be spending a lot of time with the soil. Now notice that I didn't say dirt. Soil is a living ecosystem that provides most of the resources you'll need to grow plants. Dirt, however, is soil that's out of place. Dirt is what you wash from your clothes or sweep up off the floor. Soils provide a number of different functions, including providing anchorage to hold plants in place, holding water, which also conveys nutrients and sugars to the plant, holding air, which allows roots to breathe, and buffering changes in the environment from salts and other contaminants. Plants need water, air, and nutrients, and they get all of these things from the soil. Soils are important for plant growth, and it's important to recognize that not all soils are the same. Even if you haven't thought about this much, you can probably describe some of the ways that soils can differ. You've probably looked down at the ground or across a recently tilled field and seen different colors of soil. Perhaps you've seen red-brown or iron-colored soils in some places and deep black soils in others. You've probably also seen or felt differences in texture, with some soils having small, granular particles that are about the same size, and others being coarser or having different sized pieces of gravel or rocks mixed in. You can even see differences in soil as you dig a hole. Often the top of the soil will be richer and darker because of the interaction with plant material at the surface, while the deeper soils will be a different color, tan, orange, gray, or brown. Just as we can see some differences in soil, there are differences in the physical, chemical, and biological properties of soils that affect plant growth. The physical properties of soil are the result of millions of years of geological history. The soils in your garden were rock at some point in the distant past, and that parent material still has a strong influence on your soil today. There are things you can do to improve your garden soils, but only so much. The most basic characteristics of your soils are very hard to change. Soil texture is related to the size of the soil particle. Sands are the largest particles. You can see a grain of sand and feel it between your fingers. Silt is a medium-sized particle, and clay particles are tiny. Clay particles are so small that you can't feel any grains. Clays just feel smooth. This figure isn't to scale. A silt particle can be up to 25 times bigger than a clay particle, and a sand particle can be 1,000 times larger than a clay particle. The size of the soil particle determines a lot. The mix of particle sizes present in your soils will determine how well your soil can drain excess water and how well it can hold on to nutrients. Soils are called loams if they have a mix of these different particle sizes. These soils can be some of the best for growing plants because they can take advantage of the different properties of each type of soil particle. Besides the soil particles, your soil will hopefully contain organic matter. Organic matter is decomposing material from plants and soil organisms, as well as some live microorganisms mixed in. Compost, when it's finished, is basically all organic matter. Organic matter is extremely beneficial to soils because it helps improve soils in ways that are good for plant growth. Adding organic matter to your soil is pretty much always a good thing to do. Your soil will have a unique combination of sand, silt, clay, and organic matter that will influence many other soil properties. Structure refers to whether a soil clumps together. Ideally, soils are a little clumpy and crumbly. If you have a really sandy soil with no organic matter, the soil won't have any structure. Imagine picking up a handful of beach sand and letting the individual grains sift through your fingers. There's no structure. On the other end of the spectrum, a really clayey soil can be a lot like modeling clay or clay for pottery. Everything sticks together into one dense ball. That's not good for plant growth either. An ideal soil isn't just soil particles. It also contains organic matter, water, and air, all of which are necessary for plant growth. An ideal soil is going to have a good structure so that it contains the air and water needed for plant growth in the spaces or pores between the individual particles. Not only do very sandy soils have poor structure, but the large grain sizes mean that there are big spaces between the individual particles. These pores can contain lots of air, and if it rains, the water drains quickly. A loamy soil contains a mix of particle sizes, so that some water can drain, but some water will get stuck in the smaller pores and help keep the soil moist. In a soil that has a lot of clay, the pores between the particles are absolutely tiny. They are so tiny that it's hard for water to move in the soil. Plant roots also have trouble growing in clays because they are so dense. The particle size can also affect the amount of nutrients that a soil will have. Smaller particles have more surface area. Clay and humus particles, remember, humus is fully decomposed organic matter, can hold on to a much larger number of elements. There are many challenges in gardening in soils with too much clay, but soils that have some clay or organic matter are going to be better able to provide nutrients to plants. This is a major reason why adding compost or increasing the organic matter in your soil will improve the productivity of your plants. While particle size influences soil nutrients some, an even bigger factor that determines the amount and type of nutrients that your soil contains is the parent material of that soil. Soil is basically a weathered rock, and the different types of rock contain different elements. One example is limestone rock. Soils that come from weathered limestone will tend to have a lot of calcium. Another important soil property is pH, which is a measure of soil acidity. A pH of 7 is neutral, while a pH below 7 is acid, and a pH above 7 is alkaline. Soil pH is an important chemical property because it affects the availability of nutrients to plants and the activity of microorganisms in the soil. If soils are too acidic or too alkaline, the chemistry of the soil changes and certain nutrients may not be available to plants, even if they are in the soil, because they are tied up with other chemicals. Generally, a moderate pH soil is going to have the greatest availability with all of the major plant nutrients. While many plants can tolerate ranges of pH between 5.2 and 7.8, most plants grow best in mineral soils when the soil pH is between 6 and 7, which is slightly acid to neutral. This general rule applies to most of the commonly grown fruits, vegetables, flowers, trees, and shrubs. There are some exceptions, such as blueberries, azaleas, and rhododendrons, which are acid-loving plants that require acid conditions between pH of 4.5 to 5.2. Perhaps you're thinking, I have no idea what my soil pH is. That's okay, because you can have your soil tested. Soils also have many biological properties, which are often overlooked. Soils have a ton of organisms inside them that help them break down plant materials and make good organic matter. If you didn't have organisms in your soil, old plant material would never decompose and you couldn't make compost. Even worse, your plants would struggle because they rely on fungi and other life in the soil to make nutrients available for plant growth. Plants rely on organisms in the soil to provide nutrients, just like how you rely on the microorganisms in your digestive system to break down your food and provide you with everything your body needs. Plants need soil, and you need high-quality soils to grow healthy and productive plants. Fortunately, there are a lot of things you can do to understand the soils in your garden and work to improve them over time. Whether you are working in an existing garden or a new location, a simple soil test can tell you what you need to know to get it started. There are several reasons to have your soil tested. These include learning which nutrients are present in your soil and which ones need supplementation. This will depend on the type of plants that you're trying to grow, as well as your soil characteristics. Avoid applying too much fertilizer, which can waste money, reduce plant quality, and pollute streams, lakes, and groundwater. And receiving a custom fertilization program to meet the needs of your plant while also safeguarding the environment. You can mail a sample of your soil to a lab at a university or a private company. The lab will perform different tests and then send you the results back describing key characteristics of your soil. This will include things like the soil texture, that is, whether your sand is a silt, clay, or loam, the soil pH, which measures acidity, and the level of nutrients that are available for plant growth, like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. For an additional cost, you may be able to test for additional soil nutrients or other soil characteristics like organic matter. If organic matter is not included for free, consider adding it to your order. Soil tests are fantastic because they can help you quickly identify potential issues so you can address them right away. For example, the area where I live tends to have soils that are very acidic. This is problematic because many nutrients in the soil are bound up and locked away from plants when the soils are too acidic or too alkaline. If I observed that my plants were growing poorly and I didn't get a soil test, I might try to dump a bunch of fertilizer into the soil. But it wouldn't be effective since the acidity would keep most of those nutrients locked away anyway. But with a soil test, I'd be able to see that my soils are acidic, and I would be able to apply an appropriate amount of lime to raise the pH to something close to neutral. By addressing the root of the problem, I would improve the soil pH, which would increase the nutrients available to plants. my plant growth would likely improve, and I wouldn't waste a bunch of time or money with unnecessary fertilizer. To get a soil test, find a program with your state university or a private lab. I suggest searching for the word soil test and the name of your state or province into a search engine to see what's available and recommended where you are. The lab will have additional details on how to collect and mail your sample. You'll want to get a different soil test for individual gardens. Different garden types have different nutrient needs. For example, vegetable gardens often have more demanding nutrient needs because of their fast growth and because you're removing nutrients when you collect your food. You may need to test your soil every year or every few years when you're first getting started gardening or when you are making more changes to your soil. You'll want to prepare a soil sample that is representative of each garden or growing area. To do this, you'll collect soil from numerous spots around your garden or your garden to be, since many soils can vary quite a bit even in a small location. Using a trowel, dig a hole 6 to 7 inches deep for garden soil samples. Then use your trowel to cut along the side of the hole so that you're getting an even slice of soil about 1 inch thick. If you need to, trim the sides of your soil slice so it has the same width for the entire profile. Put this sample in a clean container or bucket, and then collect samples for an additional 5, 10, or 15 locations spread throughout your garden. Once you're done collecting the samples, use your trowel to mix them together well in the container. You'll then need to send 1 to 2 cups of this mixture in for analysis. You can take a soil sample at any time of year. Many people collect samples in the spring to prepare for the upcoming growing season. If it works for you, it can be really nice to collect your soil sample in the fall as the gardening season winds down. This time of year typically isn't as hectic in the garden, and then you can decide whether to make improvements to your soil in the fall or in the spring based on what's best for your schedule. There's likely some actions you can take to improve the soils in your garden and make your plants flourish. A soil test will provide you with the information that you need to get started. Materials that are added to soils to increase plant growth are called soil amendments. There are different types of soil amendments. The most common categories are: first, materials that are used to adjust the pH or acidity of the soil. Lime, which is primarily calcium carbonate derived from limestone rocks, is added to acidic soils to raise the pH of the soil so they are closer to the neutral values that are best for most plants. Other materials, such as sulfur, can be added to soils to lower the pH and create more acidic conditions for certain plants, such as blueberries. Fertilizers provide supplemental nutrients for soils. Fertilizers vary widely in the type and amount of different nutrients that they provide. Organic fertilizers tend to be from natural sources, including minerals, plants, fish, and other animals. Conventional fertilizers are produced through industrial processes and often contain greater amounts of individual nutrients on a pound-for-pound basis. Composts and manure provide large amounts of organic matter that help improve soil structure, as well as some additional nutrients. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the 3 nutrients that are most important for plant growth. Nitrogen, which is abbreviated with the letter N, promotes green leafy growth of foliage. Phosphorus, abbreviated with a P, helps establish root systems, flower blooms, and fruit. And potassium, which is abbreviated with a K, is important for overall plant health because it helps build strong cells within plant tissue. When you look at a bag of fertilizer, the bag will typically list the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, always listed in that order, somewhere on the bag. These numbers refer to the percentage of each nutrient in terms of dry weight. For example, if you have a 50-pound bag of fertilizer that says 1608, 16 means 16% and equals 8 pounds of available nitrogen, 0 means 0% and equals 0 pounds of available phosphorus, and 8 means 8% and equals 4 pounds of available potassium. The remaining 76% is filler or inert materials. In this example, you'll notice that there's no phosphorus. A complete fertilizer is a fertilizer that contains all 3 nutrients, but you can also get fertilizers that are almost entirely one of the 3 elements in order to address deficiencies of a single nutrient. When you're in the store, you might see fertilizers, especially those marketed for lawns and turf grass, as being phosphorus-free. This is because if too much fertilizer is applied, the extra can be washed away by rain and carried to streams and rivers. In the case of phosphorus, extra phosphorus from fertilizer causes algae and lakes to grow out of control. Besides being unpleasant for people, overabundant algae disrupts aquatic ecosystems and can kill fish and other organisms. This is the reason that many fertilizers are sold without phosphorus, to prevent unnecessary application of this element.
Fertilizers, even organic ones, are bags of chemicals. It's important not to apply more of these materials than is necessary because they can lead to unintended consequences, like nasty algal blooms in lakes and even contaminated groundwater. Always read the label on fertilizer bags, follow the instructions provided, and use information from a soil test to ensure that you're not adding more than is necessary. Adding more fertilizer than is recommended can be a waste of time and money because the plants may not be able to use the extra material anyway. Besides nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, there are many other nutrients that are necessary for plant growth. Some fertilizers are available for providing these extra elements, and information can be found on the product labels.
A soil test is incredibly helpful for getting a better understanding of your garden soils and what you can do to improve your soil conditions to make sure that your plants are healthy and grow successfully. I can speak to this personally because some of my gardens struggled needlessly for years when I could have just taken a little bit of time to test my soils and take some very basic actions to improve the soils that are common where I live, which are sandy and extremely acidic. It's important to get your soil tested, but sometimes it can be hard to make sense of the results. I wanted to provide you with a few tips for how to interpret your soil test so that you can get on to gardening more quickly. Here's a real-life example from a garden project that I've been working on with some friends. This garden bed was neglected for at least 10 years. The arborvitae, or cedar trees, have grown way too large for the space and look awful. The burning bush shrub is overgrown, and the remainder of the bed consists of a few lilies, weeds, and some trees that have actually started growing into this space. Here's what the space looks like after the trees were cut down and turned into mulch, the tree stumps were removed, and the shrubs and plants were weeded out. It was at this point that I mailed the soil test to my state university extension office. Each state extension service or private soil lab provides soil test results that will look a little bit different. I got an email with the soil test results about a week after I mailed them in, and I'll share some of the highlights to help you understand what you're looking at. The lab will often provide contact information for you to ask questions as well. If it does, don't be shy in contacting them. The more you learn about your garden soils now, the better your garden will become over time. The first thing that I looked at was the soil type, which in this case is a loamy sand. This means that the soil is primarily a sand, but that it has some silt and clay mixed in as well. The pH, which measures acidity, is 6.4. This is good because most garden plants do best in a soil that is about 6.5 to 7.0 and near neutral. If the soil was acidic and had a pH less than 6.0 or 6.5, we would likely need to add lime to the soil in order to neutralize that acidity. If the soil was alkaline and had a pH greater than 7.5, an acidic material like sulfur could be added to lower the pH to a more desirable level. Soil tests often come with recommendations for how to add amendments to improve soil pH. The soil in this garden contains slightly more than 5% organic matter, and a value around 5% is considered very good. Given that the soil is sandy, this organic matter is important for helping the soil retain moisture. After a rain, that organic matter will soak water up and hold on to it like a sponge. If the organic matter level was lower, we would be looking to add compost or manure to increase the amount of organic matter in the soil. While no major additions of organic matter are necessary in this situation, the garden soil will still benefit from adding a bit of compost to provide additional organic matter and nutrients to the soil. Mulching the garden after it is planted will provide some material that will eventually decompose and become soil organic matter as well. The soil test also contains some information about different soil nutrients. If you have concerns about specific micronutrients, you can often pay an extra fee for a more complete analysis. This test only provided basic information. The soil test listed the values for phosphorus and potassium. Remember that these, along with nitrogen, make up the three macronutrients of N, P, and K. In this, we can see that the phosphorus levels in the soil are a touch high. Because there is adequate phosphorus, and because over-application of phosphorus fertilizer can be bad for water quality, this is an important signal to be sure not to add any phosphorus to this garden bed. Great, because that's one less thing to do. The potassium level is low, so that's something that will need to be addressed. Likewise, nitrogen is not listed here, but a fertilizer recommendation is provided later in the test results, so we can assume that it was suboptimal. Here's the fertilizer recommendation that was provided with the soil test. For every 100 square feet of garden area, we should add 0.1 pound of nitrogen, 0 phosphorus because there is plenty, and 0.5 or half pound of potassium. The report goes on to provide a few options for purchasing a fertilizer. Under option 1, if we could find a pre-packaged fertilizer with a 5-0-20 on the package for NPK, we could apply 1.5 pounds of that fertilizer to every 100 square feet of the garden. Unfortunately, no fertilizers are available with these proportions because the amount of potassium that needs to be added is so large. This is when we had to break out the calculator.
We decided that we could apply 2 different soil amendments. We selected blood meal to provide the necessary nitrogen and green sand to provide the necessary potassium. We didn't need to add any phosphorus to our soils, but if we did, we could have used a material like rock phosphate. We needed 1/10 of a pound of nitrogen for 100 square feet according to our fertilizer recommendations. However, since blood meal only contains 12% nitrogen and the remainder is other materials, we need to apply a greater amount of blood meal. When we do the math, it turns out that we need 0.83 pounds of blood meal for every 100 square feet of garden area. We can do similar calculations for the potassium. The fertilizer instructions say to add 1/2 pound of potassium for every 100 square feet. Since the green sand contains 3% potassium, we'll need to apply 16.7 pounds of green sand to every 100 square feet of the garden. That's a lot of green sand. It would be okay to split that addition into 2 or 3 additions over the course of a year. Additionally, because green sand is a mineral source of potassium, it'll probably take several years for much of the potassium to be integrated into the soil and become available for plants. We measured the garden space and estimated that's about 365 square feet in area. That means that we need to apply approximately 3 pounds of blood meal and 61 pounds of green sand. Our soil test also came with a compost recommendation. Remember how I said that it's good to add compost even if you have a good amount of organic matter? If you are planning to add a substantial amount of high-quality compost to your garden soil, the instructions say that you could reduce your fertilizer needs. In this case, it states that we could reduce the amount of fertilizer that we plan to add by 10% if we also apply compost. I hope that this was helpful, but if you're still feeling confused, you shouldn't be afraid to ask for help in getting recommendations for what to do in your garden. First, look to see if the university or lab that did your soil testing provides contact information for asking questions about your soil test. I know that when I received my soil test, I also received an email from a university soil scientist checking to see if I had any questions. If that doesn't work, do some online searches related to soil testing in your region to see if resources are available where you live. Or look to see if you can find a local group of master gardeners or a garden club, because those individuals will be able to point you in the right direction and provide you with all sorts of information and advice.